All right, so now that we've created the basic read endpoints for our server, let's head over to our front end and see how to make it actually load data from these endpoints. So the first thing that we're going to want to do on our front end in order to make that work is we need to set up a proxy. And basically remember that this helps us avoid CORS errors, which we get when we're running our front end and back end on different origins. So the way that we add that to our front end is going to be by saying proxy and just specifying the URL of our backend here, which is going to be http://localhost 8080. Okay, and if you have your front end running, you're going to need to restart it, okay, in order for that to take effect. Now, in order to make our application load data from these endpoints, there's a few places we're going to have to make changes. The main place is going to be inside our favorites provider and our friends provider. Remember that both of these are currently just loading their data from local storage. Okay, so we're going to basically have to change this so that it loads that data from the server when our app is first rendered. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Let's just leave these open. We're also going to have to add loading logic to our user profile page. Remember that this page is also just getting its data from local storage, and it currently doesn't use context like some of our other pages. And last but not least, we're going to have to switch over our friend detail page here to stop using context and start loading its data directly from the server, right? Because remember that I said our friend detail page is going to use the endpoint for loading an individual friend's data. Okay, this will give us a lot more flexibility for what data we load on this page as opposed to on the friends list page. All right, so I suppose we'll start off with our user profile page because this one is going to be the easiest one in my opinion. The first thing we're going to do is get rid of all trace of local storage because now that we're storing data on our server, we don't want or need local storage except in certain situations, which I won't describe right now. But generally, we're just going to remove these and replace them with calls to the server. So for update user info, I'm going to remove local storage there as well. In fact, inside here, we're going to have to actually make a request to our server to update the user info. We haven't gotten there yet, but we will. So for now, we'll just replace this with something like alert, and we'll say not implemented yet. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to remove this existing info from our user info state. And we need to actually tell our user profile page to load data from our server as soon as this page is first rendered. Now, the way that we do that, remember, is we use React's use effect hook like this. And we're going to basically create an asynchronous function inside this hook and call it. And that asynchronous function will make a request to our backend and basically set this user info state with the info that we get back. Okay? And we also need to get rid of starting info here. We don't want this anymore, so we'll get rid of that. We'll get rid of that. The starting state for our user info is actually going to be null, and I'll show you how to avoid getting errors with that later as well. Okay. Now our use effect hook, we're only going to want that to be called when our page is first loaded, so we need to put an empty array as the second argument there, because otherwise it will be called whenever this component updates, so we'll be making a lot of server calls if we forget this, which I definitely do from time to time. And next up, inside this function here, we're going to define an asynchronous function by saying const. We'll call it something like load user info equals async. And we're going to call that async function inside this use effect. And then we're going to use the Axios library, which we've already seen earlier. To do that, we need to first install it into our project by saying npm install Axios and hitting enter. And while that's installing, we can just import that up here. So we'll say import Axios from Axios. Now, since this endpoint, as most of our other read endpoints are, all of them in fact, since this endpoint is a get endpoint, we're just going to use axios.get to make the request we want. So we'll say const user info, or response rather. I'll show you how to get the user info in a minute. Const response equals await axios.get, and the URL is just the path since we set up the proxy. So we'll say slash users slash, and we're going to hard code the user ID, okay, like that. And then we're going to say set user info to response.data. And that should take care of loading our user info for us. So if we run our app again by saying npm run start, it should open that up in a browser. And if we go to my profile, we're going to see that unfortunately there is an error. And the reason that this error is happening is because remember that we set the initial state of our user info to null. So what's happening is when we try and display certain pieces of our user inside the profile info component, okay, it's trying to access a property of null, which, as all of us know, throws an error in JavaScript and causes the program to crash. So there's a few ways you can get around this. One way would be to simply set an empty object as the default value for user info. And I believe that that would fix it. So that would actually fix the error we were getting before, but now we see another error saying cannot read properties of undefined. So basically, that just means that we have some nested properties in here that are causing the same kind of problem as before. And that's why I don't recommend this default value as an empty object approach. What I do recommend is setting the initial value to null and using another state variable, which I usually call something like isLoading and setIsLoading. And its initial state is going to be true. And basically what we do is we use this isLoading state variable, allow our component to know whether it's finished loading its data or not, and respond accordingly. So what we'll do is down here in our JSX, we'll say return, and we'll use that isLoading state variable to determine whether we should display the real DOM or just a loading message. So we're going to use a ternary operator here. And if our app is loading, we're going to just return a loading message like that. So it won't try and access any of the properties that were causing an error. Otherwise, it will display the actual DOM. So essentially, it won't display anything that requires that user profile data until we've already loaded it. Okay, so that'll get rid of the error we were seeing. The last thing we have to do is we have to remember to set isLoading to false once we've actually loaded that data. Okay, so if we go back to our application now, we should see that that works, and the exciting part now is that we're getting all of this data from our server. Okay, this is coming straight from our server, which you can see if you open up your inspector window, go to network, and you should be able to find, if you refresh the page, should be able to find a call to 999 right here, or whatever you set your user ID to. And we see that we're getting this response, which is now being displayed inside our application. Cool, so that is our user profile page. The way that we're going to implement data loading in our other pages and in our providers is going to be pretty much the same, right? We're just going to have two state variables, isLoading and user info, and we're going to use a useEffect hook to basically load the data from the server. So let's go into our friend detail page and do that same thing. What we're going to do first is we're going to get rid of the favorite IDs and friends that we're getting from our context, right? Because what we're going to want to do instead is get that from the individual friend endpoint on the server. So let's get rid of those for now. We are going to want to leave the toggle favorite function, which we'll be modifying when we actually implement the endpoints for adding and removing favorites. But we can get rid of these. We're going to want to keep this friend ID use params because we're going to use that to determine which ID we're going to pass as the URL parameter when we load the friend. Okay, so we'll keep that. Selected friend, we don't need that anymore. Is favorite. That one we are going to want to load as well, and I'm actually realizing right now that we do want to keep the favorite IDs and just get rid of the friends inside use context, okay? So we need the favorite IDs because we need to know whether this friend that we're loading is a favorite or not. So let's condense this all a little bit just to make it a little more readable. And the next thing we're going to do is load our friend from the server. So the way we're going to do that again is we're going to say const friend. Oops, we're going to use the use state hook here. So we're going to say const friend and set friend equals use state. The initial value for this is going to be null. And we're also going to set const is loading and set is loading equals use state. The initial value for this is going to be true, since when the component is first rendered, it's going to be loading, obviously. Okay, and next up, we're going to use the use effect hook, and we need to import both of those up here too, by the way. So we'll say use state, use effect, and use context. And we're going to load our friend data by saying use effect. We're going to define an asynchronous function in here, which we'll call load friend equals async. We're going to use Axios as well, so we'll import that up here. Import Axios from Axios. And we'll say const response equals Axios.get, and we need to put a wait before that as well. Await Axios.get. And the URL for this, we're going to express in backticks, because we're going to be inserting this friend ID up here into that. So we're going to say load from /friends/ and then we're going to insert the friend ID into here. Okay, and once we've got the response, we're going to say set friend response.data, and we're going to set is loading to false. All right, so let's just call load friend now, and we need to set the second argument here to an empty array, and also we should set the dependencies of use effect here. And instead of an empty array for this one, we're actually going to pass the friend ID, because we do want this page to reload if that changes for some reason, right? Like, let's say that we have a button on this page that allows users to see similar friends, and that only causes the friend ID URL parameter to change, right? We would want to reload the friend data here, which is why we're going to insert friend ID into this array. All right, so next up, we just need to check is loading and friend. And before we do that, we also have to say is favorite equals favorite IDs.includes friend.id, and we only want to actually run this if our friend exists. So what we'll do is we'll say not is loading and favorite IDs includes friend ID. All right, and then let's go down to our JSX now. And we're already using a ternary operator here, so what I'm going to do instead is say if is loading, return just a paragraph tag with loading inside of it, okay? And that will basically just short circuit this component and ignore all of this if is loading is true. Now we do need to go down here and change this to return friend instead of selected friend. Okay, we'll change it there and there. And that'll work for now. So let's save this and take a look at our application by going to our friend detail page. Sure enough, we see that this information is successfully displayed. Let's make sure that we're actually getting all of that from the server. Okay, so let's take a look here. Go to network, we'll refresh. And sure enough, we see that our friend Eva Hayes is getting loaded from the server successfully. Now, one other thing we do have to do on this friend detail page is handle an error when it occurs. So essentially, when we call Axios.get, if we get back an error status code from the server, basically anything that starts with 400 or 500, it's just going to throw an error. So the way that we handle that in JavaScript when working with async and await is just by using a try catch block like this. So we'll say catch, and if an error occurred, all we're going to do, we can just print that out to the console. For now, we'll just set is loading to false. Okay, and the effect that that will have, if we go back and take a look here, if we change this to just a ID that doesn't exist, oops, it looks like I'm getting an error from this. So let's actually change this not is loading thing to friend. Okay, so we just want to make sure that our friend exists before finding out whether they're a favorite or not. Okay, so let's save that. And sure enough, we'll see, oops, couldn't find that friend if we try and look at a friend whose ID isn't in our database. Okay, so other than that, everything else is working, and we've switched over our user profile page and friend detail page to both load their data from the server. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.